say?
Detroit, the Motor City, known for being the home of Motown, the music company that put out more hits than Def Jam, Diana Ross and the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, and so many more. Detroit was a place where you could always get a hit, and not always hits of music. Drugs were hits too. Early Detroit had many dependent on its thriving economy. General Motors and Ford supplied a great deal of its residents' finance. People worked, people were proud, and people got paid. An honest job brought about an honest dollar, surely a fair exchange in a changing world, and as with many other cities like Detroit, it had its fair share of racial prejudices. They too had days of song that sang, "We shall overcome." No justice, no peace. Scenes seen all too familiar in cities with blacks all over America. There was war and despair. That would play a part in the making of the city's character. Drugs would also encompass some. Both dealers and users would really be the same. They would walk in the same circles, same paths. The money they got created an underground economy, one that gave a sense of pride. Little as be known to those who carried that pride, it was false. It was often disguised by illegally obtained prized possessions. Those that said, "Look at me, I'm so-and-so, the big man, that nigga from Detroit."
It's getting kinda heavy. Every time a little dog go cop him a Chevy. Roll through the hoods that he knows so good, that he knows so well on every block. It's the hood, that's us. Eliminated the facts, we work hard for the plaque. I'm black, my generation's pulling us back. Clap. I'm addicted to love, were you addicted to my grub? Addicted to my girl, were you addicted to cookies?
Richard Carter Jr. comes to Elmwood Cemetery about once a month to visit the grave of his father, the drug kingpin Maserati Rick, who ran a multi-million-dollar crack cocaine and heroin empire on Detroit's east side. Maserati Rick was known across the country for driving flashy cars, wearing the finest clothes, and the most expensive jewelry, even hanging out with celebrities. So it's ironic that he has such a plain-looking grave marker for a man who police say amassed millions of dollars. It's even more ironic when you consider that underneath this simple headstone is this, a $16,000 silver coffin built like a Mercedes-Benz, complete with spinning wheels.
Detroit, 1967. To begin this story, you would first have to begin with the history of Detroit, the condition of the people, and the mindset of one Maserati Rick, a.k.a. Richard Carter.
Next, we're going to turn to an anniversary. It was 40 years ago this week that Detroit erupted in flames, in riot. After 5 days, the city had seen some of the deadliest and most destructive rioting in U.S. history. More than 40 people died in the Detroit riots, 7,000 people were arrested, and at least 2,000 buildings burned to the ground. So what's happened to Detroit since? Well, a photographer who lived in Detroit at the time of those riots recently returned to his city to measure how much or how little progress the city has made in the last 4 decades.
I'm Phil Cherner, and I grew up in Detroit. I was 16 years old, still in high school, when the city burned down around me. I'd never seen anything like it, and I hope I never do again. There were armed troops patrolling my neighborhood, jeeps going by with machine guns on them, and soldiers in full battle dress. I took my camera and wandered through some of the affected neighborhoods. I developed the idea of going back and taking pictures of the same neighborhoods. I wanted to see how they might have changed or stayed the same. The shots on Pingree Street are probably the most graphic. All that was left there, a series of row houses, was the brickwork, a chimney and a staircase. Everything else was completely gone. The city has left this park there. There's a couple ball fields. We even saw some kids playing in it. The old staircase has been dismantled. The concrete steps are now stuck in the ground at an odd angle and used for kids to sit on while they play baseball. Another picture is on a street called Grand River and an intersection of Lysander. There's an old furniture store on the corner. We couldn't find any trace of this intersection at first. Not only was the building gone, it was just an empty field. If you look at the old black and white picture, there's a very distinctive street lamp. Street lamp's still there. I don't know if it works. There were times during the riot where it was too dangerous for firemen to try to put out fires, so things just burned. And when it was all over, there wasn't a whole lot left. It was really living in a battle zone. Checkpoints, tanks, fellas in helmets with M1s over their shoulder. It was scary. There's one kid walking down the block, and I think there's a cat walking through the picture at the same time. And for me, it just emphasized that this wasn't just a ruin and it wasn't just a fire. It was somebody's neighborhood. These were people's houses. One minute they were living at home, and the next minute they were completely out on the street. And I don't know that the city's ever recovered from that trauma.
Hey, it's all right. I want y'all to know that
At the time of the 67 riots, a young Richard Carter would witness the atrocities that would burn not only his neighborhood, but the images would be burned into his brain. On a normal day in July of 67, police executed a raid on an after-hours spot in a predominantly black neighborhood. Expecting to arrest a small handful of people, to their surprise, was 82 people who celebrated the return of 2 Vietnam vets. Overwhelmed, the police arrested and kicked out patrons. Of those not arrested and kicked out, some tried to find shelter elsewhere. Elsewhere was next door, and upon entering, the police considered that breaking in. All hell would break loose. There would be looting and chaos for 5 days. 43 people would die. 1,189 would be injured, and 7,000 would be arrested. Detroit would hold a history as rich as Alabama, Texas, or a dozen other cities in the South. Detroit would also move on and rebuild. Part of its rebuilding process would be building a new breed of black, illegal, fearless, with names like Butch Jones, Demetrius Holloway, the Chambers Brothers, and of course, Maserati Rick. There was a history with gangsters that ran parallel to the racial problems, and within those waters, they ran deep.
Butch Jones, man, the YBI. That's one of the biggest ones, man, for, hearing them back in the days, how much money they was getting, driving all of the hottest cars and all that, man, you feel me? Right. Real, tight organization and whatnot. YBI was one of them, man. Then I hear another brother, man, Demetrius Holloway. Okay. We hear also, I should have said this before, Sylvester Seal Murray. Okay. He had some ties with the YBI. Of course, we heard about the Maserati Rick. These were some of the major cats out here out of Detroit, man. They got a whole lot more, man. But one thing about Detroit, man, it's like a Detroit code. A lot of people keep real quiet about a lot of shit out here. You know what I'm saying? Right. You feel me?
I got you. Detroit narcotics scene goes back probably about 100 years right now, as documented. Early part of the 20th century, you had a lot of the bootlegging gangs that, although their primary product was the bootlegging of alcohol, they made money and they dabbled on the side of narcotics. Groups like the Italians, the East Side and West Side gangs, as well as the Purple Gang, which was a Jewish mob syndicate that worked in conjunction with the Italians. When Prohibition was over, a lot of the bootleggers and booze barons had to find new ways of making money. So between around 1930 to around the mid-1960s, all narcotics being brought into Detroit were controlled by the Italian mafia. Even the black dealers that were dealing on the streets throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s were all being supplied by the Italians. Around the early 1960s, Detroit had its first unquestioned urban crime lord, a black police officer who was kicked off the force, a man by the name of Henry Marzette, who went by the nickname Blaze. Blaze Marzette was a highly decorated undercover narcotics police officer who was the youngest Detroit police officer ever to reach 100 drug collars, and had worked undercover in the drug syndicate in the urban neighborhoods of Detroit from the early 1950s until he was busted shaking down some drug dealers and dealing in some narcotics himself around 1958, I believe. He served about a 2 or 3 year prison sentence and reemerged on the streets of Detroit in the early 1960s and started to consolidate his own organization, as well as fly out to Asia, a la Frank Lucas in American Gangster, and arrange his own supply line that was in competition with the Italian mafia, and started getting their own supply source. 1978, a man by the name of Milton Butchie Jones was released from Jackson State Prison after serving a sentence. I believe it was for an attempted murder. Came out of jail and created a very powerful drug syndicate in 1978 that came to be known as YBI, or Young Boys Incorporated. Butchie Jones, along with Lieutenants Raymond Baby Ray Peoples and Mark Big Block Marshall, as well as Dwayne Wonderful Wayne Davis, also known as WW, were the 4 main leaders of the YBI, who helped, as I said, Frank Nitty Usher and Harold Morton from Murderers Row develop their own contacts out of New York for a supply line, as opposed to going through the Italians. At that point, the Italians were almost completely cut out of the drug trade by the late 70s, and the Detroit Urban Crime Syndicate was almost completely, self-contained and getting their, having their own supply sources. The government came in 1983, I believe, 1982 or 1983, and levied a very wide-scale indictment of the YBI. Over 50 members were taken down in that bust. The remaining members, partially led by Butch Jones's wife, Portia, a woman by the name of Portia Sturdivant, continued the tradition of YBI for the next couple of years, with Butchie giving instruction from behind prison bars, and they were brought down in 1985. At that point, you had a large void to be filled. The area and the country were coming out of an economic recession. People wanted to get high. People wanted to live lavishly, and there was a huge chasm that needed to be filled. And there were more than a few people in this area that were willing to fill it. Around that time, you also had a man by the name of Demetrius Holloway, who was coming out of prison after serving a 5-year sentence for armed robbery, I believe. Holloway had been a protege of Frank Usher and Harold Morton in the Murder Row Syndicate. Holloway, along with his partner, a man by the name of Richard Maserati Rick Carter, carved out a piece of the city and took it for themselves.
The piece of the city they carved was Detroit's east side. Poverty and despair for some, and a way of escape for others. Some would get high, while others would get rich.
I mean, the east side is like, it's like a community of so many different parts of the east side. Okay. It's like Mac, Gratiot, Chalmers, then it's like over there by Outer Drive and Ryan and all that. There's many different sides to the east side.
With my dude, what Maserati Rick goes to the situation is the east side of Detroit, where he came from. The east side is the coldest motherfucking hood in the city of Detroit, period. And when you look at through the world, Detroit is one of the most dangerous cities in the world. So if you take the context of, if Detroit is one of the most dangerous cities in the world, and then you got the east side, the most dangerous motherfuckers hood in Detroit, what that tell you? That's where this dude grew up from. That's where I'm come from, the east side, and it's dangerous in the motherfucker.
With the climate of the east side being what it was, what it is, one would have to question what one would do. How to feed his family, how to live, shit, just how to survive. Maserati Rick would come up with an answer, And his answer would be stealing cars.
Well, when I was coming up, I was about 13, 14. Before he became Maserati, he was a little smooth ladies' man, draped up, hanging out with Tommy now, old Queens on Hopper. I was a little bitty fella. You was real little bitty. And it was just cabin, stealing cars. They was just popping cars and making money off that. And
he used to go out and steal cars, man, and police used to come knock on our door and ask for him. And go to the room and arrest him and walk him out the door. It's like they knew who he was.
Practice makes perfect. And in order to be a good car thief, Rick would first need something to drive.
My brother decided to let Rick drive his car. And next thing you know, my brother-in-law's car, the front end was in these people's basement across the street. And, yeah. The front end of the car was across the street in these people's basement. And my mama grabbed Rick, got to beating his ass. And she was like, motherfucker, you gonna do it again, you gonna do it again. And Rick was like, no, mama, I swear I ain't gonna never do it again. So she was whooping him and she hit him across the ear with the belt. And Rick was like, mama, I can't hear no more. So she said, you gonna do it again? Rick said, no. She said, goddamn, I thought you couldn't hear no more. Man.
He was also smart in like electricity type shit, man. Cause he one day, he had a bed. Like he lay on one side of the bed, the lights would come, the lights in his room would come on, and he lay on the other side, all the lights and TV, all that shit would go off.
Smart motherfucker.
And he used to go out and find broke TVs and shit out in the yard. Out people's lawn, he'll fix them up and resell them. It's just he was just a smart, intelligent, funny type of person.
Rick was a hustler all his life. I mean, Rick would walk down the street and find a toy and fix it and sell it to me. I remember all the way back where when I was little bitty kids, where I was like 10 years old. Rick was like maybe 14. And when my mom would be like, didn't I tell you to wash the dishes? And he'd be like, here go $20. And he'd be like, Greg, you or Bo wash them damn dishes. And Rick go to the house party. And I'm like, what the hell? I ain't supposed to be washing dishes tonight. But it's a payoff. And that's what he knew all his life. Pay somebody off. Give me some money, and I'm tearing people off.
Tearing people off in the streets is defined as payment, but it could also mean tearing a nigga's ass up. A trait only the strong knew, and one of the strongest Rick knew and protected was Tommy Hitman Hearns. Rick would be his bodyguard, although he was a smaller man. He would tear you off, Detroit style, which in English meant murder. His relationship would also carry to none other than Sugar Ray Leonard. This association with the top dogs of the boxing world would welcome him into their world, and with his welcome, he managed none other than his brother.
I was a professional boxer also. Rick was my manager. I just sat down with people that we sat down and we talked about hundreds of thousands. Hundreds. That's 100. Hundreds of thousands. And I'm like, what the fuck? I didn't think this was possible coming from where I grew up at. I mean, the government cheese where we had to slash the shit, and the shit just be this thick. I didn't think shit like this would happen. But Rick made it happen. And Rick was like, Greg, you want to start fighting again? I'm like, I knew what all the money was at in the family. Oh yeah. And like I said, he was my higher power. Whatever I wanted, I could call him and get it. And when I decided, like in 88, 87, that I was gonna start fighting again, he was like, okay, well, I'm finna do this, I'm about to do this, I'm about to do this, I'm about to do this. I mean, I'm talking about contracts, I mean, $1 million fighters. He had the contracts already.
$1 million contracts from a soon-to-be but non-million-dollar nigga was made possible because of Rick's circle. The circle, however, was a circle that first became a straight line. The kind of line many would get into, with a pulse that would monitor death.
This is Channel 7 Action News Brief, brought to you by Mervyn's Department Store. Here's reporter Bill Bonds.
Community leaders meeting to try to formulate a plan to beat the crack cocaine problem in Detroit and all the crime associated with it. But Mayor Young may not take the drastic steps he was talking about taking last night. The latest on that story at 11.
It's 83, and the drug game is in the first quarter. Coach Crack has his players playing straight off the poor people's bench. The opposing team fights back with the intent to finish them, and for every player fouled, one replaces him. Amongst the replacements are 3 players, experienced but amateur, and ready to make the pros. Maserati Rick, Demetrius Holloway, and White Boy Rick Wershey. Together, their team would be known as best friends. The best friends would only be friends for so long. As fate would have it, there would be conflicts amongst them that would eventually lead to murder. A rivalry had developed between Demetrius and Maserati. Wershey would be drama-free between the two, as he was necessary because he was the connect, the needed player for the network to grow. Maserati and Demetrius, however, competed for the same thing: who was number one. Maserati, not one for second place, had learned never to be second during his days as a heroin dealer, and like any man, he would be protective of his woman. The streets was talking, and one of the things said was Demetrius was on the creep with a Maserati branded female companion. This would only complicate the organization and its profits. In addition to the everyday drug dealer bullshit in politics, there would be contests amongst the best friends members. Contests so big, in fact, they would actually name Richard Carter, aka Maserati Rick.
Maserati Rick came about, he was like the youngest black man in Detroit with a Maserati. He had it I believe he had it at the age of 25. But his first car was a Benz. He used to steal cars.
From what I understand, his nickname derived from, I think him, from the stories I've heard, him and Demetrius and a couple other guys around 84, 85 had kind of developed a ongoing jovial rivalry of who could come up with the fattest ride, the car that had with the most tricked out car. One day Demetrius would roll up in a Benz, and Rick would have to come out the next day with a flashier Benz or a Beamer or what have you. But one day Maserati said, screw this, I'm just gonna top them all. And he went somewhere, I heard Ohio, but I don't know, maybe it was somewhere around here, and he got a Maserati and rolled up on these people at a club one day and was just like, it's over with, baby, I win, I'm Maserati Rick. And as a joke, they started to call that night, they were like, Maserati Rick, Maserati Rick. It kind of started off as a joke, but it just kind of stuck. And it's funny because I think a lot of people think the nickname is because Rick Carter could always be seen in a Maserati. Well, I don't think that's true. From what I understand, he preferred Mercedes-Benzes. But just that one time where he showed up and wanted to top everyone and win the contest of who can have the flashiest ride, kind of garnered that nickname, and it really stuck with him, and as a result, kind of even elevated his legacy that was already growing.
The legacy that would grow would grow partially because of the Flash, but what would propel his name was his associations, drugs, and murders. The Detroit of Maserati's day was violent, and a reputation of then was based on work, real work, the murder game. And at that time, there were a few who did it better. Rockin' Reggie Brown, Ed Hansard, and Maserati himself. These few would mix, and at some point, the mixture would go deadly wrong. Ed Hansard and Maserati had knew each other and had several dealings prior to their relationship turning sour. Different sources blamed the sourness on different reasons: territory, jealousy, or simply outgrowing each other. Maserati had already made heroin money, real money, several $1 million. Ed Hansard had made his too, but his leaned more towards coke. With the coke of Ed's and the dope of Maserati, they played exactly like the mix in the bloodstream of a fiend, speedballing. And with the speedball effect in the system of both, there would be fights. There were several street-reported scenes of turmoil, but on one climactic day, in front of Maserati's car wash, there would be war.